We're always talking about making sense of the gospel in the context of a new culture. But is that possible when the culture itself is founded upon rejecting that gospel?
Sometimes I think that when we talk about contextualization, there's something else going on. Now, what we have in the United States, and I think largely in the Western world today, is a post-Christian culture whose self-understanding is explicitly a reaction to and a negation of the Christian faith. So we're not talking about healthy culture in some respects. What we have in the West is actually an anti-culture and requires culture building, not just culture surfing.
Challenging our assumptions about contextualization with pastor and author C.R. Wiley today on the Missions Podcast in 1 minute. But first, a word from ABWE's president, Paul Davis.
ABWE missionaries are coming beside the lost and the hurting around the world. And through the Global Gospel Fund, they're pulling people from the darkness and training them as leaders. They're planting churches, and they're even beginning their own missions movements. You may already support one ABWE missionary. Would you consider a gift to the Global Gospel Fund to support all 1,000 of our missionaries? Thank you for that.
Become a partner today at abwe.org/Global Gospel Fund. Welcome to the Missions Podcast, the show that explores your hard questions on missions, theology, and practice to help goers think and thinkers go. I'm Alex Kochman, Director of Advancement and Mobilization for ABWE, joined again by Scott Dunford, West Coast Mobilizer and lead church planter for Redeemer Church in Fremont, California, recording this episode on at least here where I am, a beautiful Memorial Day. And I have the rest of the day off. Took the kids out to the diner, the only one that's open in town. That was a nice experience. Scott, I hear that you guys are beginning to do some outside parking lot type church service things. How are things in your neck of the woods?
I think things are fine. I mean, Alameda County, it's the same county as Berkeley and Oakland. And so we're probably always going to be a little bit behind what everyone else is doing as far as the slowness of opening up. But they're allowing us to, they've said, hey, go ahead and you can do outdoor car services. Today, we're expecting a new order from the governor. So we'll see, what other, I have a feeling there's enough pressure. Plus, I think the numbers are indicating that there's going to be more opening. So I would love to just be able to do like an outside service in a tent. To me, that's like what we should do. But yeah, it was fun to see everyone's faces. I mean, we were kind of prepared that it was going to be a little bit sad, the fact that we're together. I felt like just a tinge of melancholy, just it was better than doing a FaceTime call, but it's also not the same as being able to just give everyone a big hug and just have it be exactly what it's always been. So
that's how it's been for us. Yeah, it's been much the same because we had church yesterday. We had a very small group, but you realize how important a handshake is to an encounter. And there's a few of us, we shook hands, me and some of the other the elders that are there, we've been spending time together and hanging out anyway. But you realize like when you have to stay 6 feet apart from each other, you kind of like, there's this weird, like kind of sizing each other up that happens where it's like, okay, is this going to be a 10-second conversation? Or are we going to talk for a few more minutes? When you like go in for a handshake and you kind of lock hands, that's like that moment where it clicks and it's like, okay, we're going to have an actual conversation. So like in the absence of that signal, it's hard to figure out even what level of conversation you're going to get into with people. So I'm kind of where you're at. It was nice to be together, but it's not the same. It was almost like, it was, where is it? It's Ezra chapter 3, I think, verse 13. They come together to the temple and it's like some are weeping and wailing and some are shouting in joy. And you can't even tell the difference between the weeps and the cries. It was so great, but so bittersweet, honestly, at the same time. And the number of people missing. Yeah,
I opened the service with Psalm 137, just, the weeping by the shores of Babylon. And there's a good sense that some of this produces in us I don't want to go so far as to say like a sense of exile, but it does create in us a longing for what we don't yet have. Well, there's so much controversy about N.T. Wright's, constant talking about exile.
Yeah.
But I do think there's something there, and that there is a sense of, God's people are called to gather and they've always been called to gather in the presence of God. And at times that it's prohibited, and we still, even when our local churches are gathered, we still long for the great gathering, which I think is a huge motivation for missions. So how's that for a segue?
Hey, that's a decent one, probably better than the one that I had planned. And speaking of being spread out geographically, you're from the West Coast out there. I'm coming from the East Coast. And my neighbors to the north in New England, we have Chris Wiley again joining us. Chris, or C.R. Wiley, friend of the show, has been on before. And Chris, you are the pastor of the Presbyterian Church of Manchester. Do I have that correct?
Yep, that's right.
And tell us a little bit more, remind our audience about who you are, what you do, and we'll dive in. I think we've got an important topic today. And just to tee it off a little bit, something that we've talked about a number of times on the show in various ways is contextualization, how it can be done well, how sometimes it's not done well and it's taken too much to an extreme. You've been weighing in and opining on Facebook lately about that. And so wanted to pick your brain. But first, remind us about who you are, your credentials. You're a pastor who primarily writes about things like the productive household economy, and you're sort of a classicist as well. So what makes you qualified to speak in the area of missiology, aside from having an open Bible?
Yeah, well, that's a good way to bring it up or to get into it. Yeah, my first graduate degree is in missiology, and so it's a theme that I've been reflecting on for a while. Contextualization is, obviously a big part of practice of missions, and I spent about a decade in Boston as the founding director of an institute that was engaged with church planting in the urban context, and I worked with mostly immigrants, different ethnic groups that were growing in the city and were planting churches, and so I was involved with leadership training and education, and the people that were part of the urban mission world at that time, some of them are gone. I knew Harvey Kahn. Wrote for him at Westminster. I don't know if that rings a bell, that name. But and I've been involved with people who wrote and think about these issues. I don't know if you've ever heard of a guy named Sung Chan Ra.
No.
He wrote a book entitled "The Next Evangelicalism," and he was part of the staff of a church that I belonged to. The church I belonged to and was on staff with in Cambridge, Central Square, Cambridge, back in the day before everything it was gentrified, back when we still had rent control and stuff. We had five congregations. There was a Haitian congregation, Korean, Chinese, Portuguese. No, there were 6, and Spanish, and then there was the English congregation, which was made up of people from about 40 different countries. So I have a sample to work with, and there were things that there were concerns that were growing for me with the practice of urban mission, in particular in the United States, that contributed to my leaving that world, and actually contributed to my interest in households and culture from a more kind of, sort of functional and grassroots sense. So, I'm sure we'll talk about some of that stuff as we go along. But anyways, that gives folks a little bit of background on kind of the basis for some of my thinking.
There's so many ways you can go in this discussion of contextualization, and even what people mean by it could be different things. And we see in Scripture Paul commending, or recommending to the Corinthian church being all things to all people. The idea of carrying the message of the gospel without causing unnecessary offenses over cultural issues, and recognizing, I think, as well, the fact that our own expression of Christianity is certainly laden with a lot of, our own cultural baggage. Not everything we do is purely, biblical. So, just to help us move this forward, what do you, when you're speaking about contextualization or even addressing contextualization, can you give us some form of a definition of what you're meaning by that?
Well, I think, the background that I'm familiar with is there was a sense that Roland Allen's 3 selves, was inadequate, and that there needed to be a more sort of robust understanding of how the gospel is actually introduced to a particular cultural milieu. So there's a context, a kind of weaving that we have in any culture. And the practice of, being understood and proclaiming the gospel in a way that is in touch with the realities on the ground and the cultural milieu that people live in is not something that I have, have taken any issue with. My concerns are more related to how, particularly the church growth movement in the United States, has appropriated some of the thinking of missiology and how that's being worked out in the Western world. Now, there are probably things that we could get into, or there are probably issues or concerns that people have with how contextualization is being practiced in places outside the West. But my thinking is mostly related to American life and how churches are going about their work and how they're drawing on some of this language in ways that I'm concerned about.
Mm. So before we dive into some of that critique, and that's, I think, interesting, that's what we want to get into. You alluded to the three selves, which some of our audience is going to be familiar with, and some have added another self-theologizing, but that's the idea of sort of overall what it means for a new growing church and a new culture to be self-sufficient, self-sustaining, and all those sorts of things. But when you studied missiology, what were you taught about contextualization? Just unpack what you were given, especially in that urban context.
Well, mostly it was pragmatic in nature. There was a kind of superficial, set of things that we were taught related to the foundations of contextualization. But essentially, it was the idea of working within a framework of that was more or less conceptual in nature, but also that had some practical, not just consequences, but environmental influences, and that the goal was to be effective in your communication and to work within the conceptual frameworks that people had that you were speaking to. So there was a larger sort of agenda for contextualization that I became acquainted with when I left that setting. But and some of the stuff that I became acquainted with when I left that setting was strongly influenced by liberation theology and various approaches to understanding and criticizing power relations within communities and stuff like that. So I don't know if I've answered your question very well, but that's what that's sort of the background and how I was introduced to the subject of contextualization.
That helps.
Yeah, I think that's maybe slightly different, although not unrelated to when we think of contextualization on the mission field, when generally you're thinking about not just even a near culture, but a distant culture, and what are the barriers to understanding the gospel that aren't part of the gospel itself. You know what I mean? Like, obviously, when Paul, speaks of the cross of Christ as a stumbling block, that's going to be true for every single culture. But the way that the gospel is presented and making sure that it's understood clearly is certainly, I think, something you see throughout Scripture. You see Paul attempting to do that at different times, taking on a different tone, or even what he leads with. So when he addresses the Mars Hill audience in Athens, he certainly is getting to the same gospel he gets with every other group of people he's talking to, but his leading questions and the way he closes it in the beginning tend to be a little bit different based on the culture. And he's generally functioning within a culture he's pretty familiar with. I mean, he's part of the Roman Empire. He's a Roman citizen. He had been swimming in those waters. So I think when a lot of missionaries are talking about contextualization, they're kind of dealing with that issue. And certainly there's that spectrum that we've talked about already on the show of like, how contextualized do we make it? if Alex decides to plant a church in Tanzania and it's English speaking and it's got the same name as his church, and he wears exactly what he wears to church and sings exactly the same songs as he sings, that we consider that like level one, right? And then every accommodation you make to the culture and to the people you're ministering to is farther and farther down, to the point of, on some levels, we see some missionaries not even taking the name Christian, or maybe they even start worshiping in a mosque, for instance, or mimicking some of the rituals of a Hindu culture. Maybe they call their church an ashram instead, or something like that. And so we have this issue, right? And certainly, I mean, I think we could get into how it looks in America as well. But America is, at least living here, and I know that out on the East Coast, we have so much diversity and lots of immigrants. And certainly it's something that has to be thought of as do ministry here too. So Alex and I had seen, like, you had made just some comments, and they weren't like serious. They were serious comments. But they seemed like kind of just a random thought, critical of
they were little social media grenades.
Just critical of some of the thoughts of contextualization, just things that you're wrestling with. So what is your critique of it, and why are you leaning toward a critique of contextualization? And it probably gets into the ideas of culture, and is culture positive or neutral? And those are probably other, deeper level questions. So maybe you can just share with us what is your critique, or what is your concern about contextualization?
Well, that's a great way to get into it. And of course, I'm familiar with Paul at the Areopagus, but getting back to that very thing, Paul begins with creation. So there's an understanding of creation that is biblical, real, that he's using as a basis for connecting with his audience. And then, of course, he's drawing on particularly Stoic philosophy. He comes from Tarsus, which was a center of Stoic philosophy in the ancient world. So it was in the air in the very community that he had been living in as a young person. And so there were ways in which he was engaged with something that might be described as rhetoric, in the sense that he was able to follow he was engaged with an approach to his audience that would have been understood at that time as being good rhetorical practice. And sometimes I think that when we talk about contextualization, that's the sort of thing we're talking about. But then there are other times that I think that there's something else going on. Now, what we have in the United States is, and I think largely in the Western world today, is a post-Christian culture. And like Islam, we have this sort of bastard child that we have to deal with, whose self-understanding is explicitly a reaction to and a negation of the Christian faith. So we're not talking about going to a part of the world where you actually have healthy culture in some respects. What we have in the West is actually an anti-culture, and is something that we have to deal with, that I think requires us to be engaged with culture building, not just culture surfing. And that was one of the things that I kind of brought out. Culture surfing is sort of like putting your to mix my metaphors, wetting your finger and seeing which way the wind is blowing, and then just maybe this call it culture sailing now, and then setting your sail and allowing the culture's sort of trajectory to sort of propel you where you want to go. And that is a problem, because so many of the things that are going on in our culture are actually negating the very, I think, things that make for healthy culture. So just an example, post-familialism. It's just insane. But we have developed a way of life today in which I think we view children, for example, as a kind of lifestyle choice. And if you're into that kind of thing, good for you. But is that really, a healthy? Does that reflect culture a culture that's healthy, or a culture that's decadent and in decline? And if we contextualize to that, we might be able to say, well, the charisma is still there. We're still talking about sin. We're still talking about, Christ's death on the cross and resurrection and so forth. But in, I think, a foundational way, we're actually undermining many of the things that make the gospel intelligible. So that's an example.
So within that, then, one of the critiques that you would have, to unpack it, is we're assuming that culture is this bland, neutral thing that can sort of be surfed. And not only, I think, would you say that there's really, at the end of the day, no such thing as neutrality. I would certainly agree with that culture is pretty much not neutral. You can trace anything eventually back to a worldview at some point, and that worldview, in our case, is in many ways one that's anti-Christian. But is that how you're approaching it? And if so, what is there even a biblical basis for abstracting culture as this own category? It's a category that comes to us kind of recently from German philosophical thought, but we've sort of taken this category, this abstraction of culture, and we've sort of run with it. It's a word that can pretty much be subsumed to mean anything, and maybe that's what's not helpful, is we can't separate neutral cultural artifacts from things that do have a worldview basis.
Are you saying, when you saying the idea of culture is coming from a German perspective? Is that what you just said?
I've been doing some readings lately that would point that direction. I mean, that's when I see culture starting to emerge as this idea of it's its own thing.
Well, I think culture is a lot more complicated than that. I mean, certainly there's a lot of different views on culture, and it's notoriously difficult to pin down.
Right.
But I wouldn't say that the idea of culture even is necessarily coming from one perspective or another.
Yeah, and I want to hear Chris speak to it as well. But I guess what I'm talking about is that what I would agree with you is a false assumption that culture is one sort of monolithic thing, sort of this absolute sociological category.
Well, I think that you brought up, Alex, worldview thinking, and I that's actually something that I'd like to critique a bit. One of the things that I think we see just reflected in this conversation at this point is kind of an arbitrary kind of that the culture is a kind of arbitrary thing, that it's just kind of constructed socially and doesn't deal with things that emerge from creation that have to do with cultivation, getting back to the root and cult, which is worship. But the relationship between culture and the created order is something that's at the heart of my criticism. So I think that we can evaluate cultures. I think that we can evaluate, in other words, establish a set of values or think about them, think about cultures in a way that evaluates them and thinks about them just, rather than thinking of them as just sort of like a set of things that exist in our head, or ideas or concepts or practices or social institutions or whatever, but something that we can say, this particular thing over here that has emerged within this particular social context is actually tremendously destructive. I think an example would be sati, in India, that's the classic example. So,
right.
Was there a Christian way to practice sati? Yeah.
No.
And why is it wrong? Is it simply wrong because we have the Ten Commandments, or are the Ten Commandments actually reflecting something at another level? Calvin would say that the Ten Commandments are actually the natural law, which means that there's some sense in which into the universe itself, the world itself, comes freighted with meaning. And it's something that exists outside our heads. Worldview thinking reflects a kind of German idealism, which is mostly concerned with the contents of our heads. We're kind of trapped in our heads, and we can't get out. Now, we might concede, or we can concede, that getting out of your head is pretty tough to do. But in the ancient world, in the classical world, and for the early church, logos existed outside your head. It was something that, in fact, informed you and you participated in. So it wasn't something that you just kind of had this concept called, logos. It was actually something that permeated reality, and you could either be in touch with it or you weren't. And a person who was in touch with it was considered a person who was informed by, sort of the reason or the wisdom of things. So this is something that's true throughout much of the history of the West until the modern era in terms of this understanding. So if a person were going to another culture, this wouldn't necessarily mean cultural imperialism. What it could actually bring about is an appreciation for how the logos has found expression in this particular place. You could actually lead to a very positive appraisal of things that already exist before missionaries show up, and they're actually trying to work with those things. So my critique has to do with certain philosophical assumptions that inform the modern world, and really a great deal of social theory that we kind of have to deal with, and even the practice of sociology. So it's a huge topic. We can go in all different directions.
We sure can, and we want to drill deeper on that point. But first, we'll take a quick break and hear from our sponsors. So hang tight.
Hi, I'm Scott Dunford, and I would like to share with you about a new nonprofit ministry established to help churches, Christian schools, and other ministries protect children and prevent abuse. Rich Hamar from Church Law and Tax states that the number one reason that drives churches to court is child sexual abuse. I can't think of anything more devastating to these lives, their families, and our witness before a watching world than sexual abuse that takes place in ministry. The traumatic impact often leaves the vulnerable not wanting anything to do with God or his people. Furthermore, as ministry leaders, our efforts toward evangelism, discipleship, and spiritual formation are not only neutralized, but shattered. Evangelical Council for Abuse Prevention was formed last year to help ministry leaders understand the complexities of child protection and abuse prevention. They are establishing standards and an accreditation program that will help verify that appropriate measures are in place at your church or ministry. Learn more about them and their good work at abuseprevention.org. Find a helpful and free assessment tool to help you see how you measure up in this area. Go to abuseprevention.org and click on the link for this resource assessment. Evangelical Council for Abuse Prevention. Pray for them and follow along for this accreditation program coming soon.
Brooks Buser, president of Radius International.
I am here with Mark Dever, senior pastor at Capitol Hill Baptist and president of 9 Marks.
When you go to a culture that's a different language than yours, you're ending up in a kind of majority language that's been reached. And there are other peoples still more hidden, and it's those people who are often almost entirely unreached, and they take more cross-cultural effort. Is there a way we can better train people to have more realistic expectations of what life is like in the kind of 2 steps away from my culture, and be able to sustain family life with its normal difficulties there, so that there can be a long years and even decades-long witness in that culture? And it seems like Radius is set up to provide that training. Radius is about reaching unreached people groups.
Go to radiusinternational.org, radiusinternational.org.
We're back with pastor and author C.R. Wiley. One of the problems with contextualizing the gospel in unbelieving cultures is that there's a lot of philosophical, sociological freight that's already loaded into those cultures that isn't biblical and doesn't reflect a biblical view of life, creation, and the home. But Scott, I want to go to you. What do you think of that essential critique of contextualization theory?
I think where like the rub comes in missiology, right, is not necessarily trying to untangle all of those sociological problems, but really understanding where are the people at that I'm trying to minister the gospel to. What are the barriers to understanding? Just kind of like what you would do on a Sunday morning. I did that on a Sunday morning. Like I look at my congregation, I realize, okay, I've got people from these various differing backgrounds. If I use illustrations and bridges that try to help them understand a back, to understand the text that come from something that I uniquely share and they don't understand, is going to actually obscure the text, not make it more clear. But when I am able to build those bridges into their mind and their thinking from where they're coming from, they're able to understand the text more clearly. And so I think that is the role of the missionary, especially as we're moving into non-Christian contexts. Like certainly even in the West, we're still so heavily influenced by Christian. We're functioning, even our rebellion is coming out of a Christian understanding of rebellion. I mean, when people say, well, God's not good, well, the concept of how they got to God's not good, the definition of good comes from a Christian understanding of good, right? And so when we're crossing those barriers, looking for those opportunities of how to explain the gospel better from given where they're starting from, that's, I think, still the main role of contextualization. So when I hear you saying that, I don't hear you critiquing that. I hear you more critiquing, tell me if I'm right or wrong, more critiquing the accommodation of the church to the world, not the contextualizing of the gospel message to be better understood by the world. Is that accurate, or am I missing something?
Well, I think it's partly true, but I think that there's a sense in which the message and sort of the practice is bound up with each other. So let's just think about a particular example that's kind of passé right now, so it's, I guess, safe to critique. But during the 80s and the 90s, with the megachurch movement, sort of the church growth movement sort of offspring, there was an approach to church life that more or less mimicked either the big box store or the mall, kind of a consumerist approach to understanding, how to connect with people. Mm-hmm. So you ended up with, people like Bill Hybels and so forth, who built these, these ministries that had a kind of charismatic core. They had this message, but they were employing methods, taken from late night television and, hotels and how to make people feel comfortable, just all this kind of stuff. And there was very little reflection on, how the method informs the message, the medium, how the medium informs the message. Now, if we take a place like, like let's just think about Manhattan for a minute. Manhattan, and I'm very familiar with it, despite the fact that it has a wonderful Central Park, is a tremendously hostile environment to family life at a very practical level. People who tend to have children, when they do, can no longer afford to live in New York. And if they can't afford to live in New York, they have a place someplace else. So like in my church is this odd conglomeration of people. I've got what I call up and outers and down and outers, and lots of folks in between. Some of the up and outers are children of privilege. And I have a man in my church whose mother was an editor of Look magazine. And so Look was, a competitor to Life magazine back in the day. And they had their Manhattan place, and then they had their place in Fairfield County, where all the wealthy people from New York actually live. So, right. He was raised by servants out in the countryside, and, trips into the city were a treat. He told me one time about how he was at the premiere of 2001: A Space Odyssey in, Times Square because his mother was friends with Stanley Kubrick. So this is a very much, you've got this lifestyle enclave. But, I was at the General Assembly for the PCA here this last summer, and there was this sort of glowing video promoting urban church planting. And as I'm looking at this video, I'm saying, everyone in this video looks to me to be between the ages of 25 and 45. And I don't see any children. What is it about this that's sort of, I think, weird and not healthy? Now, I'm all for having, churches in Manhattan, and I'm all for church planting in urban environments and so forth. But I think that contextualizing, a church to a culture that's dying is a bad idea. And I'm thinking about it in terms of the forms that we use to communicate, but also the form. When you think about this, what you win them with is what you win them to. I don't know if if you've heard that. So what are we winning them to here? Kind of a post-familiar Christianity is what we're winning them to. So I think the critique that we need to bring to I'm not trying to pick on, downtown churches or anything. I think the problems are just as great where I live in a suburban environment, which is, got problems in some different ways. But so what we need to think about, we need to sort of recover a theology of creation that understands creation as being meaningful, not something that we bring meaning to. And that's what I don't see. In fact, I think that some people who are engaged in the work of contextualization don't have a sort of their work doesn't seem to be informed by a theology of creation.
And that's where, just to backtrack slightly, I think you see some of the overlap with, what I was referring to as far as how we use the term culture in a modern sense. That's where I think you see the German roots with Kant and with idealism, is that it's something that is just the expression of the inherent goodness of man's nature. And man is sort of able to come into creation and inject meaning rather than having a received meaning from the creator that we get to live inside of. Is that sort of what you're getting at, or am I misunderstanding?
No, I think that's exactly what I'm getting at. I think that so much of modern, social theory is dealing with the metaphysic of zero. It operates in this sort of value neutral zone, and it thinks about culture and human beings, living together in entirely efficient and material causation sort of in a kind of framework that is informed by material and efficient causation, but doesn't think about formal cause and final causes. I'm using Aristotelian categories here, but when we think about a formal cause, we think about what makes a human being, and when we think about formal causation when it comes to men and women, we think about the fact that there's a sense in which being male and being female is meaningful, and the meanings are givens. Now, there's a lot of ways in which culture can work with those things and elaborate and sort of develop those things, and that's great. That's what the work of culture is. I think the work of culture is cultivation. And are we cultivating? And or are we, doing something that resembles more of a machine, sort of this internal system in which everything kind of works together and reinforces its its various parts, but is out of touch with sort of the external reality that it operates in, and it's getting at that stuff that I'm concerned about.
Let me ask another question this way then. What you're sort of advising is that we not contextualize to a negative culture, a dying culture, an anti-Christian culture, right? That you build bridges where you can, but you don't want to assume the whole framework of something, that you pointed out and use the example of anti-familialism in a really sort of hyper urbanized, modern, sort of socialite context. So what does that look like for the missionary, but also for the people on the field? The link back to epistemology, right? And the science of knowing. How do you know the difference between one of those cultures and another? What toolbox do we have that shows us, okay, where that line is?
Well, I think that, the very image that you use, a toolbox, I think is helpful in a sense, because I think that one of the things that we have to kind of get over is pragmatism. We always, I think there's just the fact that we, have to work with the sort of the situation on the ground. But I think that what we want is to work with God and with his purposes in the world. And I'm thinking, in a larger sense than I think sometimes people think that. Obviously, when we think about the work of the Spirit in a particular place before we arrive, we want be aware of what God is already doing. But I'm thinking about it we're at a point in human history where what was inconceivable for people like the Apostle Paul is conceivable for people, and actually for many people it's almost like common sense, if you get what I'm getting at. This idea that everything is constructed, that we're kind of locked in our heads, that we're not actually able to get in touch with the world that God has made and understand certain basic things. Some of that has got to be called into question. And I think one of the things that I'd like to see is a longer arc of sort of in terms of what we're trying to accomplish. I think that very often we think in a very short term framework in terms of converts or churches established and things like that. I think that, and this is going to kind of reveal where I'm at with regard to Christianity and culture. I think that we need a Christian culture. I think that we need to recover the idea of Christian culture, and I think that there's a range of ways that can be expressed that I think leave lots of room for particular communities of people to exercise their freedom and
right. There's a lot of wiggle room inside of that.
Yeah. So when a person says something like I just said, immediately the mind goes to colonialism and to that kind of stuff. I don't think that's necessary, though. I think that there's a lot of sort of bottom-up grassroots stuff that can happen that's informed by the Christian faith, but has a particular. So I'm not like a scorched earth kind of person who thinks that we need to go around just destroying everything that exists in other places and other cultures. But I think that what I would like to see is an approach that introduces things to a culture that has a kind of organic working out over time, and that it is expressed by the people as they're working it out for themselves.
I think we tend to use contextualization in our world, in the missions world, in one way, especially dealing with far cultures. But we do a lot of contextualization even within our own culture. I mean, you're in Connecticut. I'm in California, the Bay Area. Alex in York, Pennsylvania.
And then my location is revealed.
That's a lovely place down there. I've been there many times.
It's something.
Let's stop by next time.
It's pretty country for sure, but certainly those cultures that are there and are very unique to each other, even within the same country. Here we've got very different cultures, and you have like and at first I was hearing you say almost kind of a Mennonite, which Alex would be very familiar with in his part of the country, or Anabaptist.
Oh yes, of course.
Fundamentalist, against the world kind of a perspective. Whereas like a Reformed perspective, at least a Kuyperian world, and I want to highly recommend these. Lexham Press came out with these volumes on Kuyper, and they're really well done. I'm really excited about them. But seeing the opportunity of that the role of a Christian is to build culture, even within a fallen world. So here Kuyper is functioning within the Netherlands and form a Christian nation that has gone post-Christian in many ways, and we can still see the effects of that today. But still, him seeing the role of building culture within that, and I love that kind of that vision of saying, okay, yes, we live in a fallen world, but we are called as Christians to be this new people of God and to be this new creation and to establish and build the culture within this. Is that right?
Yeah, I think I like Kuyper, and I think that his thinking, I think, is more capacious than most of the things that I read that are contemporary. I mean, he's it seems to me in touch with some of the taproots of culture, the natural sort of basis for culture.
I hear a but coming. I'm interested in the but.
Yeah,
is there a but? Are you?
Well, I think that one of the problems that we have in our situation is that there's very little healthy material to work with. He's at a stage of social dissolution or cultural dissolution that is way in the back, or way in and behind us now. And I think our situation is more desperate. And I think the problem with the idea that if we take culture as seriously as I'm suggesting, we're going to necessarily become kind of Mennonitish. I think that the problem with that critique is that it assumes that the thing that we have on the ground that we're surrounded by has got a future. I don't think it does. I think we are contextualizing ourselves, and when I mean contextualizing in this sense, I mean adopting certain patterns and sort of ways of doing, going about our work in the ministry. We're accommodating or sort of contextualizing ourselves to something that's dying. So just getting back to my earlier point about the big box church, I think the big box church is in deep trouble. And I think they know it. And one of the problems that they have is that a number of young of the children that grew up in those environments kind of have a feel for why they're a problem and just don't want to be a part of them anymore. It's not necessarily that it's not necessarily the case that they've entirely rejected Christianity, although sometimes that's the case. But they're interested in something quite different, something that's more historically sound, tradition, sort of tradition, informed by the tradition. So let me just give you an example. A couple of my son and my daughter-in-law, they're graduates of Wheaton College, and they think of themselves as high church Anglican now. Now, that's certainly not the world that my daughter-in-law came out of. She comes from a Southern Baptist background, about as stereotypically Southern Baptist as you can get. But she's very attuned to the problems with the world that she was raised in. My son, grew up in a world where I'm a very funky guy with a really funky background, and I'm in the PCA, but I think sometimes wonder why. Some people look at me and wonder why. But I think his world was always informed by this sort of larger sense of what Christianity and Christendom. And I know when you hear the word Christendom, some people's the hair rises on the back of their necks. There's a sense in which there was a kind of a culture that now people can only find in sort of high church environments that they long to be reconnected with. So I think the Kmart church, I think the big box Walmart church, so even think about how we approach church in some of those environments. Everything is sort of a product. Everything is sort of age segmented, and everything is designed to sort of isolate people and sort of get them sort of, informed or, to receive this sort of message that's cerebral in nature, but there's a kind of blindness to how the forms themselves inform the message that people are hearing.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Right. There's a neglect of, Marshall McLuhan's old adage that the medium is the message, and that the way that you communicate something at the end of the day communicates something. So now this is going to seem to run counter to some of our conversations so far, but let's drag it kicking and screaming into the realm of the practical and the pragmatic, because, well, we're North Americans and it feels like we have to. So you're sending a missionary from your church, or let's just say you're sending an urban church planter, maybe into the city, out from the burbs, into somewhere in Connecticut or New York or somewhere in that area. How would you advise that individual to contextualize well? How do you build a culture of biblical family environment, for instance, in a pretty yuppie context where having children and growing a family might be passé, or what would building that sort of counterculture look like for you? And then how hard do you press in that direction, recognizing that there might be a short-term sort of evangelistic, maybe lack of appeal to people, because there's going to be more of a bigger hurdle to joining and integrating in that sort of a church community for people who are newly converted. So what would that look like? How would you advise a missionary that you would send out?
Well, there's a lot there to think about in terms of, missionary selection, for one thing. If we think about the Apostle Paul and how he ended up with the job that he had, he was obviously the most qualified guy. I mean, he was the guy in the early church who had the credentials, scholarly credentials, to be able to operate in the larger world of the Roman Empire that none of the other apostles would be able to, I think, constructively engage. So there's that. But I also think that if my sense is correct, and I'm not saying that I'm absolutely certain that I'm right, but my sense is that if we are living in a culture that is in a sort of slow, sort of a motion collapse, there are going to be
slow burn.
Yeah, there are going to be things that occur every once in a while that show the weaknesses of the system, and we're in one right now, the whole coronavirus thing. That's what I would call a teachable moment. Where we say, okay, you've pursued this particular life that you were assured was the smart life. Well, how smart does it look right now? Is this really the way you think? You should go about living if you want to live the good life. And now there's a sense in which people are where they are. I mean, there are hundreds of thousands of people in Manhattan. I understand that. But I think, too, that there are sort of near-term challenges, and I understand that as well. But what I'm thinking about is the long term. And that's getting back to my thought in terms of taking a longer sort of view and thinking about what kind of world do we want to see in place, or 100 years from now or more, and what kind of institutions are we going to build today to help that come about? I think about something like, I'm picking on the big box churches because they're failing right now. And if we think about something like, what we see with Bill Hybels' operation in Chicago, if I had $100 to invest in a church, that wouldn't be the place I'd put it. I think that.
Does Robinhood allow for trading on churches now too? Because that might be interesting to.
Oh boy,
yeah, and that makes sense. And I can think of an example of sort of what you're getting at is, and maybe you'll appreciate the example. But you have St. Anne's in the third installment of the space trilogy, That Hideous Strength. Right, they're doing some very strange things in their context. And for those who don't know the story, go ahead and look it up. But basically, there's this whole sort of intellectual, academic, shadow government / scientific experimentation / alien occult thing happening that's taking over this whole section of Great Britain to sort of collapse together a lot of disparate things. But God's plan for the resistance is this hodgepodge group of individuals that really just is homesteading, kind of out in the country and doing what looks like a lot of nothing, sustainable gardening and reading literary classics and things like that. And of course is devoted to piety. Right. But what happens that actually causes them to win the day? There's a crisis moment. There's a revealing moment. The sort of demonic power structures come down, and that counter community is there and is at the ready. And if I'm understanding what you're saying correctly, we may not see an immediate short-term explosion of evangelistic fruit if we were to adjust our contextualization efforts to be a little bit less accommodating to culture and a little bit more insisting on building a biblical Christian culture, a sort of lowercase Christendom, or maybe however you might conceive of that, a mere Christendom. But when there is a culture, when God brings temporal judgments, when there's a coronavirus, when there's a war, when there's a famine, when there's a refugee crisis, that's when you'll experience more of the fruit, is when God opens eyes providentially.
Yeah. I mean, and just to speak to it out here, right? Yeah. And I think if we're getting funky with definitions, like I would prefer to me personally, I would prefer to leave contextualization to the idea of like, how do we contextualize the gospel message to reach people outside of your Christian faith, and maybe use this. And I'm not saying you're using it wrongly. I don't think you are. I just think for our discussions and for like the missionary discussions, accommodation may be more a better term for what we're looking at within our milieu currently. Are we accommodating the culture within the church itself rather than inside the church? And I would say here, that's just me personally. I don't think this is like that. I'm not saying this is what the scholars are saying at all. This is just because it took me a while in the conversation even to determine like what were we talking about, because my mind was immediately going to how we present the gospel and how we clothe the gospel when we're crossing cultures. Seems like here though, a couple things happen. One, you have a secular world that is really living off the fumes of a Christian society. Like the good things that are coming to our society, a lot of them are still coming off of Christianity. I just saw an interview with an atheist who is saying, who's saying they're questioning whether or not actually Christianity is essential for the survival of the West, because they're seeing the farther and farther the culture moves from Christianity, like the less and less there is to go off of. And even our current crisis of truth and what can be believed is in some ways is because of the rejection of a Christian understanding of objective truth and honesty, right? And so what we're seeing out here is that the crisis that comes when the further you get from Christianity. So the more the culture goes in rebellion against God, the more the crisis is heightened, and the more desperate people get, and then I'm hopeful, actually. I'm not a pessimist about it, because I see that actually these things actually cause people to realize how desperately they need the truth of the gospel. And I think about living in Corona times in a big city. I mean, the Bay Area is massive and lots of people, high density, huge disparities of wealth. It's the most affluent place in the world, but also some people can't hardly afford, they can't afford lodging. I mean, people live in their cars all over the place around here, because even though they've got high paying jobs, they can't afford an apartment. And when this hits, something like this hits and you have a need, where do you go? Well, the Christians, I mean, even us in our little struggling little church, of 50 people, they've got a whole host of people that just rally to them, and someone gets sick. We had a lady in our church get COVID, and I mean, they didn't have to worry about meals for weeks, because they have a whole community of people that they're building a culture and building on Christian hospitality and care for one another. And when you divorce yourself from all of those things and your world comes crumbling down because of an outside threat, you just realize just how bankrupt your situation is and how desperately you're needing more than that. And what a testimony that is in the world. And we've actually had people commenting, to, our members of our church in the community, like, wow, like you have something that we don't have. And that is a whole network of people that love and care about you. And it stands out like an incredible light in a really dark place.
And Scott, one of the things that I love about what you're saying is you're distinguishing between evangelistic contextualization and then changing internally, contextualizing the church itself to the culture. And I think that's helpful because one is a matter of rhetoric, like we talked about at the beginning of the show, and engaging in dialogue. But that doesn't mean that you're going to come into the church and rewire the church so that it blends into the culture better. Those are two completely distinct things. And at the very least, we've got to be clear that we don't cross that line.
Well, and I agree with you, Chris, about this. Like, actually, I think the attempt to modernize the church and make it seem so much more like the culture actually has the opposite effect when we're actually trying to reach lost people, and it has a really problematic effect because in a very diverse area. Because what we're really doing is when the big box churches are really kind of accommodating a 10 years ago North American white culture. And so when an Asian walks in, or when a Hispanic walks in, or when an immigrant from somewhere else in the world walks in, they finding like not only an American culture that they aren't familiar with because it's not currently happening, but it's so foreign to them, but not foreign in a way that actually brings them deeper into the gospel. And this is something we're trying to do. We're not doing it perfectly, but we're trying to say, what are some even more ancient forms that might be kind of weird in our modern American, European American culture, white culture, but that actually would resonate with people. They walk in and go, "This is a Christian church. This is not like 1990s pop music redone and all the other kind of stuff."
But so you actually think that the sacraments are important? My mind is blown.
Well, think about it. If you're a Muslim and you're searching and you walk into a church, are you looking for something like that, or are you looking for something that feels distinctively Christian? I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think that understanding like the historical roots of Christianity and building our services even around the word, the table, and even just some of those ancient rhythms of how we do worship. And I wouldn't say our church feels particularly high church, but for a Baptist congregation, it feels kind of weird because we're so used to doing kind of old fashioned modern. And I don't think that relates to people now, nor does it relate to people who are not familiar with Christianity at all. It just is weird.
Chris, what are your thoughts? And who are you seeing do contextualization well, maybe now or maybe back into church history? Examples?
Well, I think that when we think about church history, I think we can think about it in terms of phases. I think that when we think about the New Testament period, we have a situation pretty similar to ours in certain ways. You're just kind of building this wagon while you ride it. You're just trying to make it work, and you're working with this sort of heterogeneous group of people who've gathered around the message, and they're doing whatever they need to do to help each other out, and that's all great. And then, as time goes along, we can even see in the New Testament a sort of a transition occurring to more sort of familial patterns, where the Apostle Paul talks about the care of widows, and if in his instruction is this, if they have children, why aren't the children taking care of them? If they're not doing that, they're worse than unbelievers. So it's no longer, okay, let's just kind of make it work, however we can, let's just take an offering for so-and-so. Now we're trying to work with the creational structures that we've been provided by God with, and that takes us into a longer sort of time horizon, generation to generation. So I think that, when you've got a situation on the ground, initially, you're working with what you have on the ground to work with. And it sounds like that's what, Scott's doing there. And that's what I'm doing here. But there needs to be a sense of in which we think about our ministry, our work as Christians, not with the 5-year plan, but like with a 100-year plan. And what does that look like? And I think that when you go to 100-year thinking, 200-year thinking, you have to rely on the creational structure, because there's no way you're going to have any sense of what might appeal to somebody even 10 years from now. Mm-hmm. So I don't know if I'm being coherent with something, but I think that, and this gets me back to my earlier point, when we're trying to work with culture, we need to think about what makes a healthy culture. And I suggest just a few things that would be. So, for example, to me, something like biker culture is an oxymoron. I mean, that's a lifestyle enclave, and it's okay. Maybe we want to have an evangelist who wears, I don't know, a Harley Davidson jacket and to talk to these guys. I don't know, but when we talk about culture, I think we have to think intergenerationally, and we have to think about history. So, like when I think about like when someone uses the term, gay culture, well, I don't know. I mean, I'm not sure that's if you're using culture as just sort of a set of convictions or kind of a worldview sort of thing, and maybe some kind of network or group of people who live in some part of the city. Well, okay, but if we're talking about culture in the sense of cultivation, then I think things like language, and history and intergenerational patterns that are actually conducive to actually passing along.
Right. You can't have an LGBT culture any more than you could have a weed garden.
Right.
Right. It's counter to the notion of long-term healthy cultivation.
Yeah. And that's what I think I'm missing. That's the part of the conversation that just doesn't, or the subject that doesn't seem to come up in the conversation when it comes to contextualization.
Well, that's helpful. And man, I'd love to keep going longer. This is enjoyable for me. But as we wind down, I think to boil it all down, this is practical. It's not only theoretical, but it is practical, because to those who are engaged in missions, we need to be thinking long term. We need to be thinking not just beyond how can I immediately begin bringing the gospel to people, and how can I plant a church, but what is that church going to look like 100 years from now, 200 years from now, should the Lord tarry? I think that's critical. And I think it's also critical that we, in our engagement in missions, be thinking about building a counter culture in a Christian sense, in a godly sense that obviously respects language and tradition and traditional garb and things like that are sort of the no-brainers in going into a new cultural setting. But building that counterculture, that community, something that can on its own stand the test of time. So I think this is helpful. I think this gives us some tools that we're not used to thinking about, thinking long-term and thinking of building something that's distinctively Christian. So thanks for contributing that to the conversation. It's a helpful back and forth. And I think, this is some helpful place to land. So people, if people wanted to hear more from you, Chris, how could they do that?
Well, as you know, I don't normally write up on the subject of contextualization, although I've been thinking about doing some more work in that area and maybe even writing about it at some point. But as you know,
when you're done writing about Tom Bombadil.
yeah, that's right. I'm working on that book right now. But if you are interested in learning about what I'm doing and where I've been and that kind of thing, you can go to my author website, crwiley.com.
Very good. Well, thanks, Chris. And you're also on the Theology Pugcast with our mutual friend of the show, Glenn Sunshine, too. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, Glenn. And then, of course, Tom Price. Yeah, it's a lot of fun to do this, to have connection with those guys.
Well, very good. Well, thanks for joining us today. We appreciate your time.
Well, thanks for having me on.
To get more content, go to missionspodcast.com or check out abwe.org/podcast. If you like what you hear, please subscribe, rate, review, and share. To ask a question or suggest a topic, email alex@missionspodcast.com, and we'll see you next time on the Missions Podcast.